Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Varia, and today we're talking about unidentified flying objects in classical antiquity, which is this really, really good paper that you can read off the NASA website. Now, people who are into UFOs love these kinds of things because you can study UFOs without having to think about Lockheed Martin, right? Or Northrop Grumman, or the Chinese, or the Russians, or the Germans for that matter. And so we love these things because is it ours explanation is totally off the table. Um, and so that's why I initially read this paper, and it's a really good paper. It has, a bunch of really interesting, what we would call today UFO sightings, right? In 100 BC in Rome, a round shield burning and emitting sparks ran across the sky from west to east at sunset. We love that kind of stuff. But as good as this paper is, I know for a fact that when you're reading nonfiction, the best part of any paper, the best part of any book is the bibliography, right? It's not enough just to read nonfiction and say, oh, that's interesting what they wrote. No, you want to know what their sources are. And then you want to read those sources for yourself to see if you come to the same conclusions or not. And so I did that just a little bit with this paper because there was one specific account that I honed in on, and it was this. At Arpi, round shields were seen in the sky, right? So this is just an example of a bunch of different sightings similar to this, right? But the whole round shields really sounds like to my ears, flying saucers. And I'm not alone, right? But I decided rather than to look at all the different accounts and all their original sources in their original context, just to focus on this one. And I did one other one as well, but we'll just focus on the round shield therapy. And what I did was I used, Perseus, at tufts.edu. I went to original source, which is the history of Rome by Titus Livius. And what I found was really interesting because what I found was that ancient UFO sightings are a lot like modern UFO sightings, not just in what they look like, but the context and the presence of high strangeness and how people react to this, right? Traditional ufology, or at least online, it seems, has this kind of nuts and bolts emphasis where people, they only want to know about the craft and how the craft flies and whether or not they can, explain that using science or replicate the technology, right? And that's a valid method. That's a valid way to look at it. And then some people, they're only into consciousness, right? And they'll even go as far as to say, the whole crash retrieval narrative is BS and it's all about consciousness. Okay, that's a valid, you know, method to study this as well. But I think that the best way is bots and bolts, right? And when I read this in its original context, what I see is thoughts and bolts, right? So again, I'm focusing specifically on Livy or Livius, uh, his account of round shields being seen in the sky at Arpi, right? And what I found, reading this whole account, right? This account in its context, right? It starts with Hannibal's attempted invasion of Rome, right? Going through, the Alps, right? And it talks about how he got stuck in the Alps, and then how his Celtic recruits from Gaul, from what's now France, were mad because he stopped at the Alps, and then they turned their anger from Rome to Hannibal, but then they realized they needed Hannibal, so they stopped being angry at him. Um, so that's interesting. So this is, during the Republic, before the Empire. It talks about how um, there were two consuls. So before Rome had an emperor, they had two consuls, which would be kind of like the equivalent of two presidents today, right? It's not the same thing, but that's a rough approximation. So you had the Senate, and then you had these two consuls. This guy, Gnaeus Servilius, was chosen as one, and then another guy named Gaius Flaminius was chosen as another. But Gaius Flaminius was interesting because he neglected what are called the auspices, right? Which are the public and private, rituals with regards to the gods, right? Their public and private adoration. So he didn't pay attention to that, right? Remember, this is before there was a separation of church and state. This is before the Enlightenment, where religion wasn't just a beholden to one building you visit once a week. It permeated all society. So the government was in charge of these festivals, and apparently Gaius Flaminius just kind of ignored it, and so people were really upset because now they couldn't, go consult the gods at the temples, the oracles, whatever, with regards to their business and travel and that sort of thing. And what happens next is interesting. So you have a bunch of different events in different places that would fall under the rubric of high strangeness in ufology, right? So, for example, these are called prodigies. Modern English, we might call them more wonders. Okay. So at Sicily, a bunch of soldiers, their weapons got set on fire for some reason, right? In Sardinia, a horseman was attacked by a burning snake and he died, right? The shores had fire on the water, right? Shields were bleeding, okay? Just a lot of weird stuff was happening. At one place, soldiers are struck by lightning. At another place, burning stones are falling from the sky, what we might call meteors. And at Arpi, right, at Arpi, shields were seen flying through the sky. Again, a parallel with the flying saucer phenomenon. And the sun seemed to be fighting the moon, right? Again, something akin to Fatima, right? At Capena, two moons had risen by day, and at Chaere, the waters had flowed mixed with blood, right? Even the very spring of Hercules flowed with gore, stained with bloody spots, right? At Antium, ears of wheat, when reaped, fell bloody into the basket. So a lot of weird stuff going on, along with unexplained aerial phenomenon, right? You got your unexplained aerial phenomenon, and but then you have just weird things happen, right? Um, so again, high strangeness. Now he goes on to say, other things, weird things were happening, like the statue of Mars at the Appian Way started sweating. There was fire in the sky and wool falling down with the rain. Okay, that's very similar to the whole angel hair phenomenon in ufology. Supposedly, sometimes when UFOs are seen in the sky, later what's termed angel hair falls from the sky, and some people theorize that this might be part of the outer shell of the UFO falling off as it burns off. I don't really know, but that's one theory. Uh, and then other weird things happening, right? She goats growing wool, roosters turning into hens, and hens turning into roosters. Okay. Um, and what's interesting is the reaction, right? So all these reports were collected and taken to the Senate, and then the Senate had to decide what to do. And as the story goes, they started doing all the auspices they're supposed to do, right? So they started doing the sacrifices and decorating the different temples and shrines of the different gods with different things, like they gave Jupiter a new golden thunderbolt weighing 50 pounds, right? That sort of thing. And that's how the story ends, and they celebrated Saturnalia. So again, I think the modern parallels with ufology are many, right? So first of all, notice that it's a time of danger, right? There's this time of a kind of instability, right? The whole Nimitz encounter happened during the Iraq War. Um, the whole, Roswell, all those crashes in the late 40s. Well, what was that? That was right when the Cold War started, right after we developed nuclear weapons and we had used them. And then we got into Cold War with the Soviet Union. That's when we had these flaps in the late 40s and early 50s. And notice the military context, right? So we're always talking about fighter pilots and what they're seeing in the skies, and or what's appearing near our nuclear weapons, our nuclear silos, our nuclear bases, UFOs appearing near them. So these are all military contexts, right? And so just as in antiquity, all these weird things were happening in military contexts. Okay, and also a time of instability, right? You had story about the Carthaginians, invading Rome. Um, so that's the first thing. The other thing is the role of the government, right? So all these reports are collected and it's taken to the government. So just as the White House or the Pentagon, or now recently the Senate is the American Senate, that is so into the UFO subject and trying to evaluate all this stuff. We're having hearings and all these things. The Roman Senate was too, apparently, right? All these reports were collected and then they had to figure out what to do. But then there's also differences, right? There's disconnects. So well, let me finish with one more similarity. In the Roman context, what did they do? They interpreted this through the lens of their religion. And you see some UFO contactees, and now in ufology, due to the scholarship of people like Diana Pasulka, where some people are either interpreting the UFO phenomenon through a religious lens, or they're interpreting religion through the lens of the UFO phenomenon, right? So just as in antiquity, these two subjects, like the UFO and religion, right? Ufology and religion, they overlap. They overlapped in antiquity. In antiquity, they were perfectly parallel, right? The Romans were like, these are signs from the gods. Like, we're not doing the auspices, we're not doing the rituals we're supposed to. Let's do them, right? Let's give Jupiter a new thunderbolt. Let's decorate the temple of Juno. Um, in antiquity, it was like perfectly parallel. In modern times, they merely overlap, right? And you see that with, Chris Bledsoe, big time experiencer, but a lot of people are troubled because he said he calls these things angels, right? And if you're not Christian or Jewish, you don't like that, understandably. And I'm Christian and I don't like it either. But we have to acknowledge that these two subjects, they overlap, right? Because what are they both talking about? Religion. All religions, almost all religions, are about people coming from the sky, right? Beings coming from the sky and teaching us stuff, or interacting with us, or messing with us, whatever. And what's the UFO phenomenon about? Things in the sky teaching us, messing with us, interacting with us. Okay. So these two subjects overlap, right? And that's where I think one of the disconnects also happens, right? So in the Roman Senate, they didn't do a cover up, right? They didn't do a psyop. They didn't psyop their population. They didn't gaslight their population and say it wasn't happening. They acknowledged it was happening, but because everyone in that time, or at least in the Senate, viewed their world, the whole world, through this kind of like pagan lens, this polytheistic religious lens. They dealt with it in a polytheistic pagan religious way. Okay. But post Enlightenment in the West, especially, um, what we did in the Enlightenment was not abandon religion. We simply took religion out of everything, right? We took religion out of government, we took religion out of economics, we took religion out of warfare, and we put it all into a building that you visit once a week, right? So any talk of clairvoyance, any aka prophecy, right? Any talk of clairvoyance, any talk of telepathy, any talk of the supernatural gets all kind of stuffed in this building in your town that you visit once a week, right? And if you don't go there once a week, you're not getting access to any of it. You're not even hearing it about any of it. And if you talk about it outside that building, so to speak, that church or synagogue, you're crazy, right? Because the secular space, right, the common space, has become irreligious, for better or for worse. Okay, but the Romans weren't there, so there was no need for a cover up. And so I wonder if the UFO cover up isn't explained so neatly by national security, right? Hey, we got to hide this because we want to figure it out before the Russians do. And if we do, maybe we can use it against them. I think that's true. But I think there may be something deeper going on in as much as that. Whereas in the West, secular society, right, the common culture that we all share, the popular culture, is irreligious, it's secular, it's atheistic, and even religious people usually go about in public life in a way that is indistinguishable from the atheist or the agnostic, right? Especially in the United States, um, we don't have a common language, right, to explain or try to explain what this stuff is. We don't have an agreement on what it might be or may not be, and so what we do is we hide it. We put it in a wooden crate, so to speak, um, in a Lockheed Martin facility in Chatsworth, California, right? So just as the religious was concentrated and hidden in a building at the center of town once a week, be it a church or a synagogue, the UFO phenomena for the last 80 years, what do? We hide it in a building out in the desert, literally out in the desert, underground, where no one has access to it, right? And so it's interesting how, at least in the last 80 years, we've treated the UFO phenomenon in the same way we've treated religious phenomena. And that's assuming the two aren't connected in any way. Again, in ufology, it seems that people interpret religious phenomena through the lens of the UFO, or they're starting to, some people, not me, starting to interpret the UFO through the lens of religion. I think that's a mistake. I think we should have a separation of church and state, but also a separation of church and science, a separation of church and history. Because ufology is this weird thing that melds science and history, and also now metaphysics, right? So we have philosophy, science, and history. And I think we should keep that away from religion simply because this needs to be a game that everybody can play. This needs to be a field of research that everyone can participate in, and that we can come to some basic answers that everyone can agree is real. After that, you can do what you want, right? You can call it aliens, you can call it kami, you can call it angels. I really don't care. But I think that a secular approach to the UFO phenomenon is best when we're all working together. But in your own private time and place, you can study it any way you want. Um, and the more lenses, the better. I don't think there should be one lens through which to study um, this this phenomenon. But I do think it's interesting how, in the case of the shields from ARPI, those flying shields we mentioned earlier, they happened in a larger context, right? That wasn't the only weird thing that happened. A lot of other weird things happened. And those weird things were connected to religion, and they happened in a military context, and the government got involved. And but however, like I said, the disconnect is that in Rome, the government didn't try to hide it because they had a shared collective lens, the whole society did, so to speak, through which to view this. Uh, And so there was no need to hide it. And so maybe that's why it's hidden today, because we've lost a shared collective lens. And so if everyone's interpreting this through a different lens, you run the risk of causing societal chaos, maybe. Even though I just said we should all use different lenses to study this. But again, like I said, the predominant lens should be a secular one, just because, again, that's how we study every other thing in history, every other thing in science, and that'll get us more answers, if that makes sense, in my view. Um, so yeah, I think that's all interesting, right? It's not. It has never been about weird things in the sky only. Okay, those weird things in the sky are part of a larger context of other weird things here on Earth of all stripes and shapes. And those weird things are often interpreted through a religious lens. And it almost seems like that can't be helped. Okay. So tell me what you think. Like and subscribe. All the YouTubers say that because it works and it's what needs to happen. So until then, remember your consciousness is not classified. Consciousness is not classified. Learn to meditate.